Next song I want to share with you is my current radio single. It's sitting at number 9 on the national chart for this month. And just found, actually, as I was driving in today, I was going through Wadesboro and was listening to a radio station, and this song came on. And I was like, I know this guy. Got excited. I was jamming out to it. Everybody looking at me like I'm weird, but y'all have already figured out I am. See, you're one up on them. There you go. But I want to share this thought with you. The song is simply entitled This Day. Listen to the words of this song as I share this with you today. When I heard myself getting on my keys, I thought of my old man. So I called him up and we shared a laugh. And he said, son, now you understand. Boy, it goes so fast. Don't let this moment pass. Floors will get scratched up, walls will get marked up, a ball's gonna wind up breaking a vase. But floors can be sanded, walls can be painted, and a vase can be replaced. But you can never get back this day. When I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but think how tired his voice had grown. The strongest man that I ever knew had somehow gotten old. Boy, it goes so fast. Don't let this moment pass. Floors will get scratched up, walls will get marked up, a ball's gonna wind up breaking a vase. But floors can be sanded, walls can be painted, and a vase can be replaced. But you can never get back this day. As I look around at this mess we're in, they're fast asleep, and I'm holding them, my little girls, my whole world. Floors will get scratched up, walls will get marked up, a ball's gonna wind up breaking a vase. But floors can be sanded, walls can be painted, and a vase can be replaced. But you can never get back this day. No, you can never get back this day. You know, that song became a reality to me on Christmas Eve of 2019. We just finished Christmas festivities, and I was sitting there at my grandmother's house, and when I stood up out of the chair, I hit the floor. As soon as I hit the floor, my mom and dad, they're in the medical field, and they started working with me, and it took about 10 minutes. And they couldn't get me responsive, so they immediately called EMS. And one of the guys that knew my family real well and worked with my dad showed up there that night with the EMS unit. And Mom said that they put all these monitor things on me, and he turned around, and she said, this 7'1" guy, hell as a sheet, looked at her, and he said, we got to go. He said, Shellem's having a heart attack, but where it is, it's in the back of the heart, known as the Widowmaker. He said, we got about 20 minutes, that's it. They loaded me up. We got about a mile down the road. Luckily, the Hospital was only a couple miles from my grandmother's house. We got halfway to the hospital and I woke up. As I'm laying there in the back of that EMS unit, all I see is a 7'1" man over top of me. And even though I may be country redneck, I ain't crazy. So I just laid there. And I got to the hospital, and after they started doing tests and had about 50,000 wires coming from everywhere, the doctor walked in. The first thing he said to me and my mom and dad that were there, he said, "Are y'all religious in any way?" My dad explained to him I was in full-time ministry, and he looked down at me. He said, "Son," he said, "I just got one explanation. Your God's not done with you." He said, "That's all I can tell you." He said, "Because your heart attack that you were having stopped about the time it was doing major damage." And he said, "So it went long enough to give us information that we needed that your body wasn't making blood." He said, "But it didn't affect you as bad as it could have been." And so he sent me to this doctor, who sent me to that one, who sent me to that one. That one sent me back to this one. Y'all know how the circle goes. And every single doctor I went to, this is something I never understood. Every doctor I went to took blood. Now, if I ain't making it, why are you taking it? You know, it's not like I can go to Walmart and pick it up, all right? But finally, I got to a doctor that knew my family and specialized in several different things with the blood and as cancer as a whole. She looked at me, and this was in March of 2020, right when COVID started, and I was in that room by myself, and she looked at me and she said, "Shellem," she said, "I'm not sure how to tell you this." She said, "But I think you may have leukemia." Folks, can I be honest with you? It was at that very moment of my life that I was done. I didn't have the guts to go out and tell my family that was in the parking lot. So she went out there to tell them, and I sat there in that room by myself, and I kid you not, this is what I did. I looked up to heaven, I said, "Seriously?" I said, "God, I go out and I sing for you every weekend to, in all honesty, people who could care less if I show up or not." And I said, "And this is the thanks I get for it." And I can remember sitting there and I said, "I'll make you a deal, God. I'll put the microphone down. You take this away and we'll just call it even." God had a different plan. That next day, they brought me in for a bone marrow test. And can I tell you that when all that was over, they looked at me and told me, they said, "Well, it's not leukemia, but we don't know what it is." She said, "But we're going to try something," which is never a good thing. She said, "This is what we're going to try." She said, "I'm going to bring you in this Wednesday and next Wednesday." And she said, "I'm going to give you some blood, some iron, and we're going to do just a little bit of chemo to try to shock your body to start making blood." She said, "That's the only options we've got." It confused me. That was way above my pay grade. I don't even know what that meant. But I know when I showed up that first Wednesday, when I walked in that chemo room, there was a whole lot of patients in there was a whole lot worse off than I was. And so I tried every way I could to make them laugh. I tried to make them smile, give them some encouragement as they were going through their treatment. That night when I got home, I was sick as a dog. And that next morning, I didn't want to get out of bed. And that following Wednesday, can I tell you, I wasn't laughing when I showed up in the chemo room. So I'm sitting there, I put my earphones in as they began the treatment, and I blared my music as loud as I could. And all of a sudden, I looked up, and a sweet little lady, about 15 minutes into it, little lady on the side, she just kind of looked at me and waved. I waved back. She said, "You're Shellem Cline, aren't you?" And brother, can I tell you how mad that made me? You know why that made me mad? Because I'm in my comfort zone when I'm up here and I'm sharing the good, or at least trying. But when I was at my weakest point in a chemo chair, I didn't want anyone to know I was even there because they saw me when I was weak. She looked at me and she said, Shellem, she said, my husband and I followed you as you were growing up. She reminded me of a concert that I'd done at South Idaho High School. I put on a big homecoming concert every year in Troutman. And she said there was about 500 people there that night. She said your band was with you, y'all were playing. And she said at the very end, you grabbed a stool and just sat down and your guitar player just started playing and you just sung Amazing Grace, just you and a guitar. She said 9 souls got saved that night. I said, yes, ma'am, I remember that well. She said, my husband and I talked about that. She said, because it was more than a concert, it was an actual worship service where God showed up. She said, Shellem, my husband passed away about 4 months ago. She said, about a week to the day after he passed away, I found out I had cancer. She said, I know this is not the time or the place. She said, but do you think you could sing just one verse of Amazing Grace for me? Even though I did not want to and had no desire to, I started singing. And there was 9 patients in that chemo room that day, and all 9 of us started singing Amazing Grace to the top of our lungs. Tears were flowing. Doctors poking their heads in, trying to figure out what's happening in the chemo room. We sat there for an hour, sung Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. 2 days later, on that Friday, I walked back into that doctor's office for them to take more blood. As I'm sitting there in the room, the doctor walks in, shuts the door, and props up against the door and smiles real big and says, 3 for 3. So what is that supposed to mean? She said, you're the 3rd patient I've seen today that was in that revival service on Wednesday. And I said, you heard about that? She said, yep, and I know you started it. Brother, I get blamed for everything, all right? She looked at me and she said, but Shellem, she said, I'm not going to look at you and tell you your numbers are good. She said, because they're not. She said, but what I am going to look at you and say is God must have shown up in that chemo room. She said, because you're the 3rd person today I get to smile at and say, some way, somehow, your numbers are absolutely perfect. And she said, there's only one explanation. God showed up. Folks, can I tell you something? I had to get to my lowest point to realize that this whole thing is way bigger than myself. I, as an individual, I like sharing the good things. But it's the bad and the ugly. It's God's favorite time to move. How many of y'all are still breathing? Okay, about 90% of you. That's good. Good statistic. We'll take it. But you know, can I tell you this? If we're still breathing, we're still writing our story. On your tombstone, you've got the beginning date and the end date. But in all honesty, when you think about it, those aren't what matters. What matters is the dash in between. And right now, you're writing the dash. That's what you're writing right now. And every day we wake up, we get to write a brand new page in our story. Sometimes those days are filled with the good, which we like, right? Carolina fans are liking that. I'm a Dookie myself. Y'all pray for me, all right? I cried about 2.5 hours last night. Stop laughing. That's not funny. Amen. But you know, can I say this? You like it when the good happens. But the bad and the ugly is what we want to hide. The bad and the ugly is what we don't want to talk about. And see, before all this happened, what brought this on was a lot of stress that was going on in my life. And I'm going to be honest with you, there were nights while I was battling through this, and even before all this happened with everything that was going on in my life, I would lay at bed at night and say, God, I don't get it. Can you please just tell me why I'm having to face this battle that I'm facing? Can I tell you that God showed me this is a whole lot bigger than what I could have ever imagined. And that sometimes we have to go through the bad and the ugly because somebody else is going through the exact same thing that you're going through. And the only difference between them and you is that you have the hope of Jesus Christ. I'm singing in a little small town called Sneed's Ferry, North Carolina. Y'all probably know where that is, on the eastern part of the state. And I finished up a Sunday morning, just a few weeks after all this had happened. I was exhausted. I hadn't got back to my normal self yet, if there is such a thing with me. And all of a sudden, this sweet little lady walked up with a cell phone in her hand, and she said, Shellem, she said, will you take just a couple minutes to talk to my son? And I said, yes, ma'am. And I picked the phone up, and you could hear the anger in his voice. You could hear the frustration. You could hear just how miserable he was. And he had started explaining to me that his wife had walked out on him, told him that he was worthless, took the kids and ran. And he made the statement that I made in my life and said, what's the use anymore? And I told him, I said, brother, I said, where are you at? He was a half mile from the church, and so he met me in the parking lot of the church that morning. And as I walked out there, I got to his truck, about maybe 10 feet from his truck, and he reached over in the front seat and picked up a gun and put it right here. I froze because I had never had this experience take place. And he began to tell me just how bad everything was. And it was at that moment of my life that I realized this young man could have cared less how many #1 songs I've had on a chart somewhere. This young man could have cared less what stages I've been able to sing on or whose phone number was in my cell phone. He needed to know that everything was going to be okay, and he had a reason to keep going on. And I began to tell him my story. The bad and the ugly that I tried to hide, that was parallel and was the exact same story as his. The only difference was there was different characters, but it was the exact same. And right there in the middle of that church, I poured out my heart to this young man, which I had never done before. He looked at me after I poured out my heart and he said, so why? He said, if you work for God, why does your God make you go through that? And for once, I figured out the answer. God gave me the answer right there in that parking lot at Sneed's Ferry, North Carolina. And I looked at him right in the face and I said, for you. He looked at me and he said, you don't even know me. How in the world did you go through all this for me? I said, because I was where you were at. I said, I had the gun in my hand thinking about it. And I said, but I can stand on this side and tell you that even on the worst day of my life, God's still God. And He's got a plan. And I can tell you that if you keep marching on, you keep going. I said, it's not fun and it's not easy. I said, but in the end, you win. That young man with tears in his eyes looked at me and said, you think your God would love me? And I said, brother, let me tell you, He can love me, He can love you. And that young man took the gun down from his head, handed me that gun out the window of his truck. I grabbed a hold of that door. I yanked that thing open. I grabbed him. I pulled him out of that thing. And right there in the middle, that small little church in Sneads Ferry, North Carolina, in their parking lot, about 1:30, yes, after God's office hours. Some of y'all will get that halfway home, amen? At 1:30 in the afternoon, that young man in the parking lot, I had the opportunity to lead that young man to Jesus Christ. All hope was gone an hour before. But God showed up even after the church doors were closed. See, folks, I don't know what time it is, but I promise I'll have y'all out in a minute. I promise. You'll be out by 2:30. I promise. Each and every one of us are writing a story, whether we like it or not. And each and every day, we write the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it's in the bad and the ugly that's God's favorite time to show up. Why? Because when He turns it around and makes it good, there's only one person that can get credit for it. And guess what? It's not you. It's not me. It's Him.